Hi, I'm Ted Pattison from Critical Path Training. In today's session, we're going to look at what's new in the developer arena for SharePoint 2010. So let's go ahead and first of all reflect back on what we had in SharePoint 2007. Basically, you could install SharePoint 2007 on either Windows Server 2003 or Windows Server 2008, and you had your choice of either 64-bit or 32-bit. Now, on top of that, we also had the .NET Framework 2.0, 3.0, and you were able to get .NET 3.5 working if you added some extra configuration and did some extra installation to each of the front-end web servers. Now, we had Windows SharePoint Services 3.0, and we had Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007. So that's the environment that we are probably experienced working in. And now as we move to SharePoint 2010, what we have is we have an evolved version of both MOS and WSS 3.0. So now we have this new name for WSS 3.0, the Microsoft SharePoint Foundation 2010. So that's the underlying platform. And what I like to think of Microsoft SharePoint Foundation, just like we used to think of WSS, it is the core aspect of the platform that gives us the provisioning engine. So really, SharePoint is a platform that's all about templates. We have site templates, we have page templates, we have workflow templates, we have list templates, and people at Microsoft provide templates out of the box, and you as a developer can provide your own templates for things like workflows and pages and lists and sites. And Microsoft SharePoint Foundation gives you the basic plumbing that allows you to install your templates on a farm and then have solutions where your templates are instantiated into sites and into lists and into pages and into workflow instances. Now, on top of SharePoint Foundation, we have Microsoft SharePoint Server 2010. And that's analogous to what we think of from 2007 from Microsoft Office SharePoint Server. There are two different SKUs of the basic SharePoint Server, Standard and Enterprise, and a lot of the functionality that we've had in the past, what we're going to have now, plus more. Now, some things to note as you look down at the lower levels of this particular slide. Well, we see that we support Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008 R2 and only 64-bit editions. So there is no more 32-bit story for installing SharePoint on a server operating system. Now, some companies might look to that and say we have to upgrade our hardware. That is a downside to it, but the upside is that now that the SharePoint server code only has a single 64-bit code base, well, that's going to make it a lot easier for Microsoft to root out and eliminate all bugs because of no need to basically have parallel code bases on two different platforms. Another bright thing about this new platform for developers is now Microsoft supports installing SharePoint on a client operating system. So if you have Windows 7 64-bit or Windows Vista with the latest service packs, we can go ahead and install either the Microsoft SharePoint Foundation or SharePoint Server 2010 on top of those. So we can have a full development story, without having to go to a Windows Server 2008 machine. Okay, now as we move on, this is what we call the SharePoint workloads. And the Microsoft investment as they built out SharePoint Server was split up. Now, if we look at the first one, sites, we kind of think of that as the basic SharePoint Foundation provisioning services and also the collaboration list that we get out of the box. So just being able to have sites and being able to have users create subsites and create lists from the basic collaboration lists, gives us, our first workload. Now, the next one is communities. And so that really kind of points to Microsoft's investment in social networking and the fact that SharePoint Server 2010 and SharePoint Foundation gives us things like wikis and blogs out of the box. We have things that are carried over from SharePoint 2007, such as user profiles and My Sites. And then we have some new aspects of SharePoint Server that really get into the social networking end. Things such as enterprise metadata and the ability to tag all sorts of items so that communities can participate and people can specify which list items and which documents they like best, and other users are able to take advantage of seeing what is popular or how something has been tagged. Now, as we move down from communities, we have content. And the content workload pretty much points to anything that has content in its name. So web content management, enterprise content management, document management, records management, information rights management, all those technologies and their implementations in SharePoint Server, really point to the content workload. Now, the next workload we have is search, which is pretty self-explanatory. Now, the SharePoint Foundation has a search capability built within it if you're not running SharePoint Server. And once you install SharePoint Server, we're going to get the enterprise search capabilities so that I can run a search from within a site and search for documents anywhere inside my farm, and also in external content sources, such as a Windows file share or an Exchange public folder, or any type of back-end data source that we can connect to through the new Business Connectivity Services, or BCS. Now, as we keep moving on, our next workload is Insights. So Insights really points to Microsoft's business intelligence strategy. So outside of SharePoint, we have SQL reporting services, we have SQL analysis services. That's what we have on the server side. And over on the desktop, we also have Excel, the desktop application that allows users to look towards SQL analysis services databases and look at cubes and create pivot tables. And so what SharePoint does is it complements what SQL Server has and what Excel has by providing some BI web parts, the charting web parts, also by including Excel services so that users who are working with Excel can publish their spreadsheets into a document library, and then Excel services is able to load those spreadsheets in a server-side calculation engine and perform calculations and also push back HTML-based spreadsheet views to the users if necessary. Now, in addition to Excel services, Microsoft has performance point services. In the last version of SharePoint, it was somewhat of an add-on, and now with SharePoint 2010, the BI story is much more cohesive, to the fact that performance point services is just included with the enterprise SKU. It gets included out of the box, and it just exists as another application service to be configured. So performance point services is what we use when we need to look at something such as a SQL Server Analysis Cube and to start creating dashboards so that users can see things like performance KPIs, key performance indicators, and scorecards and reports, and filtering web parts so users can be provided with BI applications that allows them to really slice and dice data. Now, the last workload is composites. Composites, you can think of as the next generation business data catalog from SharePoint 2007. So everything about composites centers around a new set of technologies which is called BCS, or Business Connectivity Services. And what we have is a way to, in many ways, build no-code applications that connect to back-end systems. Whether it's a SQL Server database that has a customers table with 1 million rows, or whether I need to connect to SAP or PeopleSoft or some other back-end, that's basically what the composites workload is targeted at. Now, continuing to move through, what are some of the new things, just to call out what we can look towards as a SharePoint 2010 developer? Well, there's going to be a lot of improvements to the user interface and accessibility features. And one of the issues that we had in the last version of SharePoint is that it was just very common that the users were forced to cause postbacks for almost every imaginable chore. And so what we'll see in our first demo in just a few seconds is that the user interface has been overhauled to make it far more Web 2.0 savvy. So by having lots of AJAX in pages and lots of commands where just the JavaScript code on the page is able to satisfy the user request without requiring a postback. And in times where we do need to talk to the server, what we'll see is that the user interface now does behind the scenes asynchronous JavaScript callbacks, so to prevent having to do postbacks. Now, the next thing we'll see is we have much better tools for developers, starting with the Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint tools. So in the past, we've had many different approaches for doing SharePoint development, and there was really no consistency or obvious choice as a developer. You basically, picked between 4 or 5 different approaches. Well, now with SharePoint 2010 and these new SharePoint tools that are built into Visual Studio, we have a very good approach that, we're all fairly confident that, will be the adopted strategy of the majority of SharePoint developers. Now, we also have end-to-end integration with PowerShell. If you're like me, you're one of those developers whose head's down in SharePoint, who doesn't really get to new technologies till it's important or until it's part of your job. In the last version of SharePoint, well, there wasn't any inclusion of PowerShell. You could optionally try to add in some PowerShell integration. But now with SharePoint 2010, the SharePoint server team has pretty much brought their server product on par with the other Microsoft server products, such as SQL Server, such as Exchange, and they now have PowerShell management integration through and through. So STS ADM is still there, but mainly for backward compatibility. So it's now time to learn PowerShell if you haven't learned it already, and there's also opportunities for us to create PowerShell snap-ins. Now, in addition to what we've heard about so far, there's a bunch of additions and improvements to lists and event handlers. There's a host of new event handlers that developers had requested in the 2007 timeframe. Something such as an event that fires as a child site is created within a site collection. As far as lists go, there's new improvements in how we deal with large lists. There's new throttling so that we prevent users from sending requests that would ultimately bring back 10 or 20,000 items at a time. So there's a lot there to help, but there's also a lot there when we get to large lists that you have to know as a developer, because the landscape has changed from what you might be used to in SharePoint 2007. Now, there's also new integration with LINQ, Language Integrated Query. And what's really neat about that is in SharePoint 2007, when we want to query a list and get data back, generally we've been forced to write CAML statements. Now, CAML hasn't really gone away, but now we have a link to SharePoint provider that's built into the basic SharePoint installation. And so now what we can do is we can generate LINQ classes, and we can do all our programming with LINQ. And so it's a far more natural style of development for when we want to return data from a SharePoint site. And as we write LINQ statements, behind the scenes, what's really going to happen is that the SharePoint provider to LINQ is going to translate our LINQ statements into CAML and execute that against the server. Now, in addition to LINQ, we also have a brand new client object model. So let's say you're building a Windows Forms application, and you need to reach across into SharePoint and pull back list data. Or you want to create some type of a management application where a site collection owner can use your Windows Forms application to connect to the site collection, possibly to add users or add SharePoint groups or do something with security. Now, in the past, well, we had some of the ASMX web services that were built into SharePoint that gave us some capability, but quite often we had to learn CAML to be able to use those, and they certainly didn't give us the same surface area coverage as the regular object model that we use over on the server that comes from Microsoft.SharePoint.dll. But there was a host of other ways that we could connect and basically deal with either content or just SharePoint objects. And now, instead of having 2 or 3 or 4 different approaches, we now have a client object model. So as I write a desktop application, I'll simply reference a desktop DLL, and there is classes inside this object model for the site collection, for the site, for lists, and we simply create objects and call methods, and it deals with the remoting by sending things back and forth across the network. So as far as building desktop applications or building Silverlight applications that run out of the browser, having this new client object model, is going to open up a lot of opportunities and make accessing a SharePoint site from across the network a much more straightforward thing. Now, in addition to the object model, we also have some additional support for workflow applications, such as in the last version of SharePoint, all we had was the ability to create workflows on list instances and documents. So now we're able to specify different targets. The site can be the target of a workflow. So I can run a workflow and it doesn't have to run on a list item or it doesn't have to run on a document. Now, in addition to some of the changes that we have with workflow, there's a lot of big changes to how we deal with external data. Now, if you're familiar with SharePoint Server 2007 and the Business Data Catalog, you're probably familiar with creating a BDC application, which allows you to connect to a back-end system and to pull back data and surface it in a read-only fashion. Well, now the landscape has really changed. We're going to create something like a BDC application with the new BCS, Business Connectivity Services, but it's going to be called an external content type, and we're going to be able to create those with the SharePoint Designer. At a high level, it's still the same thing. It's still metadata that allows SharePoint to reach into a back-end system and pull back data, but they're going to be far easier to create. And once we do that, we're going to be able to surface them in SharePoint by creating something called an external list. And the external list allows us to see the data as if it were just a native SharePoint list, and a huge enhancement as we compare the BDC in 2007 with the new BCS architecture and external lists is now external lists support writing back to the content source. For instance, you could connect to some back-end SQL database, create an external content type, an external list. You could then take a list item, open it in edit mode. It seems just like a regular SharePoint list item. Make a change, save it, and that's going to write back to the SQL database. So some really neat things there to look into as far as how we connect to external data. And then the last thing to point out is, the architecture for external lists, is not part of SharePoint Server. It's actually part of the SharePoint Foundation. So it doesn't require SharePoint Server, for you to start, building solutions that deal with external data. Now, in addition to that, we have a new service application architecture. Now, in the last version of SharePoint, SharePoint Server had something called Shared Service Providers, SSPs. And they were server-side application services that allowed us to share resources, such as the indexes that we built from crawling content sources, user profiles, and things like that across all the different sites inside of a farm. So now Microsoft has changed the architecture. There are no more shared service providers. Instead, there's a new infrastructure for creating service applications. And this architecture is not built into SharePoint Server, it's built into the SharePoint Foundation. Now, the SharePoint Server team had to take all their existing shared service providers and rewrite them under this new service application architecture. But the opportunity also opened up the ability for many of the Office client application teams, such as the Access team, the Word team, the Visio team, to create their own application services. So now these teams can have a server-side presence that can be installed automatically with SharePoint Server or installed as an extra add-on. And they're able to do things such as take a Visio diagram and render it through the browser. Now, the great thing about the service application architecture from the developer perspective is that it's extensible to anybody. So conceivably, if you had a motivation to create some type of a service application and plug it into SharePoint, there is an extensibility model where you can create your application, your service application, plug it in, and take advantage of some of the infrastructure benefits, such as getting automatic load balancing if your application service needs to be scaled out across several different application servers. Now, there's two more things we want to cover. One is the idea of sandbox solutions and user code. In the previous version of SharePoint, most of the things we did as a developer had to be installed on the front-end web server via a solution package. And in environments where the developers had control over the farm, that wasn't a problem. In other environments where developers aren't allowed to do anything that would cause any changes to the front-end web servers, well, there was no ability to do anything as a custom development effort and push it out into the farm. So the idea of sandbox solutions is that as a developer, you can create a business solution and then upload it at the site collection level. So we don't require the farm admin to have to do anything. They set up an environment where user code and sandbox solutions are allowed, and then we have site collection owners that decide, hey, here's a business solution, there's a WSP that I'd like to use. They upload it to a local gallery at the site collection level called the user code gallery, and then they're able to benefit from what's inside there. Now, as we write sandbox solutions, we have to understand the things we can and cannot do. For instance, you can't push things into the layouts directory because it would require that we put something down on the front-end web server's file system. So we learn what the rules are, but then as we create sandbox solutions, all of a sudden my development efforts can be pushed out in all kinds of places where it wouldn't be possible if I had to push it out as a farm-based solution. Now, the last point is that we have some changes to the security model with something called claims-based security. Claims-based security is going to allow us to embrace some of the new SOA standards in security as far as being able to identify a security principal through basically a security token created with SAML, Security Access Markup Language. And that's going to allow us to participate in things like federation, to allow us to far more easily acknowledge Live ID as an authentication provider and leverage that inside of SharePoint sites. Okay, so that was just a quick explanation of probably the biggest changes that you're going to see for us developers as we move to SharePoint 2010. Now, in a demo we're about to see, we're going to look at a brand new team site. One of the things that you'll see is that the user interface is different. The Site Actions menu has moved from the right to the left, but also there's a whole new paradigm where we have something which is called the server ribbon. Now, in the past, we've seen in SharePoint that users have to go all over the screen to get commands. Sometimes in the Site Actions menu, sometimes commands are in the List Action menu, sometimes they're in the ECB menu, sometimes there's a link at the bottom of a web part. And so the move to the server-side ribbon, first of all, kind of gives the user the intuition of anytime I need a command, we know the first place we want to reach is up to the server ribbon. The second thing about going with the server-side ribbon is it creates a consistency between the server-side workspace and what users are used to as they work with Microsoft Office applications such as Word and Excel and PowerPoint. Now, one of the things that we're going to see with the ribbon in my first demo is this new Ajax-like behavior. And what we're going to see is when it's time for me to create or edit a list item, well, they're going to be able to do that without having to make any postbacks to the server. Okay, so let's start by just bringing up a regular old team site right here. But look at the team site, it's quite different. The first thing that I want to do is, if we drop down the Site Actions menu, let's go ahead and take a look at the Site Settings page. The Site Settings page you're used to, so you can look at different galleries inside here. I might want to change some of the title or the quick launch aspects. But if you're familiar with the Site Settings page in 2007, you can see that many of the same links are still going to be there. Now, what I want to do here is let's go to one of these lists that they pre-create when we create a new team site. So here's the task list. Let's go ahead and notice that with the server-side ribbon, we're on Browse. And so what's somewhat of a paradigm shift is I can get to the tab for the list itself, but there's also a tab for the items. So now when I look at items, well, now I can come down here and I can click on New. And so here's where we get this Ajax, Web 2.0 style behavior. So what we have is we have a dialog that comes up. Notice that this is just a div. This was a hidden div that they make visible with this new JavaScript API that's behind SharePoint. So when we come down here, and we'll have our first task to learn SharePoint, and it'll be normal. We're just now starting. We're at 10% complete. Who is this assigned to? Notice that we can go ahead and assign it to one of the Contoso users, Brian Cox. Put a description of the task inside here. And now watch what happens when I click Save. It basically pushes back, but there's no post back. So it's asynchronous JavaScript executing behind the page to send that back to the server to basically update that task and to update the UI here. Now let's create one more task. And let's say once we've learned SharePoint, we want to start, creating SharePoint solutions. And notice that there's this notion of predecessors. So this task has to be finished first. This is not started yet. This is 0% complete. This one is also going to be assigned to our good friend Brian Cox. And once we get that in place right there, we can go ahead, put some other stuff in. So now we have these two different items in place right here. Now, another thing about the UI is that I can hover over things and I can select them and hover over things and select them. And so being able to delete multiple items gets to be a real nice change that we have inside. Okay. Now, you've seen the way that these work right here. Let's go ahead and go back to the home page. So as I go back to the home page of this site, what we'll see is that team sites are created to be based on not just regular web part pages, but wiki pages. So if I go ahead and I drop this down, notice that I can go into an edit page mode. If I go into this edit page mode right here, note that the ribbon gives me a rich HTML control. And what's nice about the rich HTML aspects of this is that they work very well cross-browser. So if you're using Firefox and you're using this particular ribbon, you're going to have a good experience. Now, notice that the wiki page has a big body of text, and they make it very easy for you to come down here and to switch it back and forth. Maybe I just want to have a single column inside. Maybe I want to go ahead and grab all the text and start from scratch. And I'll go ahead and we'll put my title inside. And then we'll bounce the text down and put some more text inside here. And now, let's say that I want to add a picture inside. Well, if I go back to Insert, if I say Insert, and then we say Picture, note that I'd be able to pull a picture inside here. And as far as searching for a particular picture, if we go on my machine and we go ahead and we find a particular picture somewhere and put those pictures in place, it's going to automatically upload it to something called the site assets. Now, behind the scenes, let's go ahead and move back here. I'm not going to save my changes there. If I go to the all site content, notice that there is a special document library called Site Assets. So one of the things they're trying to do with this new UI is to really streamline things so that your basic users without a lot of knowledge of editing web pages, will be successful. And so by having this wiki mode where they can automatically add things, and by saying insert picture, and they bring up a dialog that automatically allows me to add a picture, which will upload it into the Site Assets document library and automatically add a link to the page, just streamlines the user experience. Now, I'm not going to add a picture in this demo. What I do want to do is, let's go back here to the page that I was just creating, and let's go ahead and go back into edit mode one more time. And last time I threw away my changes because I wasn't really sure I wanted to keep them. But now let's go ahead and move back to one of these other modes right here, 2 columns with header. So as it goes and makes these changes right here, I have some basic text and some more text. And let's say that I just want to add a web part right inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say Insert. And I'm going to go ahead and say Insert a web part. And what's really neat about this is that we can go ahead and add web parts just in line with our other text inside. So the ability inside of a wiki page to freely edit and manipulate text and then add images and then add web parts in line as free-flowing text, really kind of increases our capability of having users being able to make pages look just the way they want without having to have a lot of training to get there. Okay, so let's go ahead and move back to all site content one more time, just to look at some of the things that are built in. Another thing to note is in SharePoint 2007, when you work with publishing sites, they have a style library. And quite often when you're working with cascading style sheets and images, you are encouraged to work with the style library. But when you work with any other type of site in SharePoint 2007, there's no style library. So you basically had your branding approach for publishing sites that differed from your branding approach from team sites. Now we note that the style library is a document library that gets created when you create any site, including a blank site. So as far as leveraging the style library to put your style sheets and different images for branding efforts, that's where we should go now. Okay, so this quick walkthrough of a SharePoint site, what we should now see is that there's a server-side ribbon, and the server-side ribbon is where many of your commands will be. The ribbon is contextual. As you go to different pages, the ribbon will change, and as you go to one specific page, the ribbon will change as you click on one web part and then deselect it and click on another one. So just remember that the ribbon is contextual, and what you have selected in the UI will often influence what controls you see on the ribbon and which ones are enabled and which ones are not.